Hi, everybody. I'm Ava from Detroit Audubon. I am our research coordinator, and I am here with our program coordinator, Sarah, and Dr. Lindell from Michigan State University. And Dr. Lindell is going to present about the use of American kestrels as pest control at Michigan orchards. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can put them in the chat. So if you kind of take your mouse and hover at the bottom of the screen, a toolbar will pop up and there's a chat option. Click chat and the chat will pop up. You can put any questions there. And then I will read those questions at the end for Dr. Lindell to answer. And I think that is all. The presentation will be about 30 minutes to 45 minutes. And then we'll have time for questions, like I said. And I think that is all. Thank you so much for joining us. And now I will pass it over to Dr. Lindell, and she can start her presentation.
Okay, so now I'm gonna, let's see. Oh, so can you see the slide now, the blueberries?
Yep.
Okay. All right, well, I'll get started now. Thank you very much for having me. It's really nice to be able to share our work with Audubon societies in the state. And this is the name of the program. It's American Kestrels and Ecosystem Services in Michigan's fruit growing regions. I seem to have hit a, oh, let's see. There we go. Okay, so I just wanted to make a quick distinction here between ecological functions and ecosystem services and disservices, because I'll use these terms as we go along. And so ecological functions are just interactions that happen between species in nature, things like birds dispersing seeds or birds eating insects. And then in some cases, we can translate those into ecosystem services or disservices if they have some benefits or some cost to humans. So for example, when we have turkeys eating apples in apple orchards, we would consider that a disservice. And so about 10 or 12 years ago, I had some colleagues in the Michigan State fruit growing extension offices, and they told me that birds were quite a problem for fruit growers. So let's see. So here's some other examples of disservices provided by birds. So this is damage by birds to grapes and damage by birds to apples. And they also eat sweet cherries, are very fond of sweet cherries. So you can see some sweet cherries are missing, some are damaged. And so I started looking at this issue. And here are some blueberries that have also been damaged by birds. And so we applied for some funding to try and get farmers some techniques to try and mitigate the damage provided by birds. And our first funding source was USDA, or National Institute of Food and Agriculture, as many people know it. And they have a specialty crop research initiative. The Cherry Marketing Institute and Michigan Grape and Wine Industry Council also helped fund this work. So this was a several-year project. Let me just mention what a specialty crop is. It's any fruit, tree nuts, vegetables, and some of these other categories that I have listed here. Excluded from specialty crops are commodity crops, big crops like soybeans and field corn. And this is just important because certain research programs are specifically under the specialty crop category. So NEFA has allowed for funding to be assigned to specialty crops, which is really important in Michigan because we do have a lot of fruit and vegetable production. Okay, and I just wanted to mention too that there were a lot of different institutions around the country involved in this work, specifically institutions in the northern US because we share a lot of the same fruit species. And we also brought in people who did various types of research. So we were really interested in the ecology and bird management, but we also brought in a professor from MSU who looks at consumer responses to how food is produced. We brought in an economist as well. And so here's just a list of the researchers because I like to give people credit for their activities on the project. So one of the first things we did was a survey of fruit growers in 5 states in the US, and we got about 1,500 fruit growers to complete the survey because we wanted to document what are the actual costs of bird damage in fruit crops. So these are some of our results from sweet cherry growers. And what you can see is on the far left, we have the 5 states where we solicited growers to respond to the survey. Then you can see in the middle, there's an annual bird management costs column. So you can see, for example, that a Michigan sweet cherry grower spends about $380 per acre trying to mitigate bird damage. You can also see that we asked the growers to estimate their current percent loss to bird damage. So you can see Michigan sweet cherry growers estimated that at 13%. So I won't go into all the details here, but essentially we use this information along with local price data and production data, you know, how many sweet cherries or what weight of sweet cherries are produced per acre to estimate what the actual costs were to fruit growers in these various states. And so what we found out was that in these 5 states, producers of 5 different fruit crops lost about $200 million to pest birds. So these are the types of things that fruit growers do to try and deter birds. So this is one of these propane cannons. And if you live near a fruit production area, you may have heard these go off. And so they're very loud. They can work in particular situations to deter birds, but it's going to vary a lot on how much effort the grower puts into it and what kinds of strategies they use. Other things people have tried to use are things like these things you might see at a car wash. We call them inflatable tube men. And like with the propane cannons, depending on how much effort the grower puts into it, they're going to have various types of success with it. If they move it around a lot, if they start it early in the season. So these are some of the types of things that growers do to try and deter birds. We were particularly interested also in looking at whether we could attract natural predators to fruit growing landscapes in order to use these, this natural predator-prey interaction to help farmers manage the birds that are eating their crops. So some of these natural predators are birds, and the American kestrel, I'm sure, is familiar to all of you. It's the smallest falcon in North America. And here it is in the hands of one of my former graduate students, Megan Shave, and I have to give her a lot of credit. She did a huge amount of work on this project. It was a real, she was really innovative in some of the techniques she used to study the kestrels while we did this work. And here is the range of the American kestrel. So what you can see is up here in Michigan, it's considered to be a breeding resident. Now I know down where you are and in southern Michigan generally, we can have kestrels staying throughout the winter sometimes, but that's not the case so much up in northern Michigan in the Traverse City area where we did a lot of our sweet cherry work. So there they tend to be pretty strict migrants moving out in August to their wintering grounds. Now this is a more concerning map of North America, and what it shows, these are data from Breeding Birds Survey, or a map from Breeding Bird Survey data, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with and you may do routes. And this is a large survey that's been going on with volunteers since the 1960s. They walk various routes around the country, and from these data we can estimate population trends for species. And so these data are for the American kestrel in the United States from and into Mexico and Canada from about the 1960s to 2010, depending on the data availability. And what you can see are areas in red are where kestrels have been significantly declining. Areas in orange are where there's an uncertain trend, whether they're declining, staying stable, or increasing. And the green areas are where they have been significantly increasing. So you can see that for much of the continent, the trends for American kestrels are not positive. And specifically in the area in northern Michigan where we worked, which is called the boreal hardwood transition, you can see that there's been a significant negative decline from 1966 through 2014 in the number of kestrels that are sighted on these breeding bird survey routes. So this is just to illustrate where we did this work. So the red area, the counties up in northern Michigan, we call cherry land, and the areas down in southwestern Michigan, we call blueberry land. And of course, there are sweet cherries grown in other parts of the country as well, but that's just our shorthand for this presentation. And so what we did was start to put up a lot of kestrel boxes in sweet cherry land in northern Michigan. And we were helped along by the fact that a lot of growers had been putting up boxes or they'd been letting Boy Scouts put up kestrel boxes on their land. So there was a population of kestrels that used the area. So we put up a lot of these boxes in sweet cherry orchards. Here's my grad student, Megan, again. We could monitor the boxes. This is not one we put up, but she developed this system based on some previous work people had done. You can see that's a pool skimmer. There's a little video camera at the top that she could use to look in the box. And then she has a little screen down by her face, and there's cables connecting these different parts. And so we could actually monitor what was going on in the boxes without having to take the boxes down or use a ladder. We also tried to look at what the kestrels were bringing to their young, what they were provisioning, so that we could figure out what types of species they were taking that might be beneficial to farmers. You know, were they taking any of the crop pests out? And so we had cameras. Initially, they were set up. You can see in the top left-hand corner, there's a box with a camera, and it was inside the box. And so we initially started out with cameras inside the box. But what we figured out was that after a couple weeks with the nestlings in there, they were just spraying excrement everywhere and obscuring our view because they covered up the cameras. So then you can see in the lower left, we started putting the cameras outside the boxes, and this was much more successful. So here's a picture from one of the cameras that was inside the box. This is a kestrel showing up with some insect prey. So we documented that they eat a lot of different types of insects. And here is one from the camera outside the box, and you can see that they have gotten a bird here that they're taking into the box. So they eat a number of species of birds as well. And a very large portion of their diet is also small mammals, particularly voles. And these are can be quite damaging to crops. So this is a benefit to farmers if they take these out of the system. And these are some data I'm just showing from 2014. And what you can see here is on the bottom horizontal axis, you can see the different numbers for the boxes that we had these cameras up at. And then you have these bars. And the green part of the bar represents the proportion of arthropods or insects that they brought to their young. And the red part of the bar represents mammals. And the blue part of the bar represents birds. And you can see then there's a few others, like there's a snail once in a while, a mollusk, once in a while they'd bring a snake. But you can see the majority of the provisioning trips that they took were made up of insects or mammals. And there were some birds, not a huge number, but we think the fact that they take birds means that they can also be seen as a threat. And so they may deter birds, even though they may not make up a huge part of their diet. So yes, data from 2014. Now okay, so if we took some of these information, we just did some back of the envelope calculations, and we estimated that 16 kestrel pairs in northern Michigan that were using nest boxes in the orchards, you know, over the nestling period, what they could remove from an ecosystem were nearly 30,000 insects, about 1,100 mammals, mostly voles, as I mentioned, and about 768 birds. So we wanted to do something more definitive to figure out whether the kestrels actually deterred the fruit-eating birds. So in 2015 and 16, Megan set up a lot of these transects, or she walked through orchards in these rows. She documented the numbers of fruit-eating birds that she saw. And she did this in orchards with kestrels that had active nesting attempts and without kestrels. So these were 10-minute surveys that she did. She did them multiple times in an orchard over the season, and then did some statistical analyses with them. And I do have a few graphs I'm going to show here. On the left side, you can see there's a a pink bar next to a blue bar, and these are for sweet cherries, our results. And then next to that, there's a shorter pink bar, and then just kind of a black line. And the takeaway from this graph is that when there were kestrels nesting in an orchard, we recorded a significantly smaller number of fruit-eating birds in those orchards compared to when there were no kestrels in the orchard. So this suggested to us that the kestrels were important and could deter fruit-eating birds from orchards. And these are our, I just wanted to mention, these were Megan again and two of our field assistants, Logan Clark and Bobby Shave, who were also important in collecting the data. Okay, so this is a graph. This is what happens when you get an economist involved in a project. This is just to remind me to tell you that one thing we were interested in doing is figuring out what the economic benefit could be to the regional economy or Michigan's economy if all sweet cherry growers in the state used kestrel boxes in their orchards. They put the boxes up. If they got similar rates of kestrel occupancy to what we did up in Leelanau County, there are reverberations through any economy when you have, for example, more product in the system. So what we did was estimate how many cherries were saved by kestrels, how many fewer were eaten by fruit-eating birds when kestrels were in an orchard. And then we did some estimates as to what benefit this could provide to the state. Because when you have more sweet cherries in your system, for example, you may need more drivers to drive the cherries to businesses that use the cherries. Farmers that produce more cherries may be able to make more income, and then their family can spend more money in the local town going to the restaurant or buying things. So those are some of the reverberations of producing more cherries in a system. And so when we did our calculations, what we estimated is, you can see from 2016 through 2020, we could estimate the number of jobs that would be created using the software program that my economist colleagues used. And we could also estimate the GDP, or gross domestic product, increase for Michigan based on more cherries being in the system that had been saved by kestrels. So what you can see is that we have low and high estimates here because these are just estimates. What you can see is that we estimated over these 5 years, if sweet cherry growers used kestrels as part of their pest management, they could create between 46 and 50 jobs in the state, and it would generate between 2.2 and 2.3 million more dollars for Michigan's GDP. So that's a really nice illustration of the potential economic benefits of using natural predators for pest control. We recently had some other funding from the National Science Foundation, and one of their programs is particularly interested in how human and natural systems work together. And so what we did was expand our work from the sweet cherry land up in northern Michigan down to southwestern Michigan, which I mentioned we call blueberry land. So that's where a lot of blueberry production takes place in Michigan. And so with this funding, we set about making more towers. We bought some kestrel boxes and we created these towers that we could put them on so that we could install them in blueberry land and monitor their progress. So these are just a few slides. This was Megan again. She did not get stopped, even though this looks like a pretty, maybe a safety hazard, but she drove these to parts of Michigan where we were putting them up. I also enlisted my husband to move stuff into a van, and we thought it was a good omen there that you see a sandhill crane on the truck that we rented. We also ended up doing a lot of this setup in the winter time when things were a little bit calmer. So this is just us trekking out to a blueberry field in southwestern Michigan. And then I was the brawn of the operation, so I would dig the holes for the tower. And then my grad students, Megan and Melissa, would put the box on the tower. So here they are drilling. So the boxes were on a bearing that could turn. And so that meant when we brought the tower down, we could keep the box upright, which of course is important if you have eggs or chicks in there. So here we are then putting it all together. And you can see how the boxes are on that tower, which has that hinge. And here we are finally getting it up into position. And you can see the blueberry bushes in the background there. So essentially what we wanted to do is see if our results from Sweet Cherry Land would transfer down into another crop that's grown in Michigan. So we did get some success in blueberry land. So here's a clutch of kestrel eggs in one of our boxes. Whoops, sorry. Okay, and here are some kestrels, some young ones that hatched from those eggs, and then we would band them and we would weigh them. And here's a couple of my more recent graduate students, Sarah and Olivia, who really enjoyed this work, as you can see. And then, of course, they would approach fledging. I really liked this slide here. You can also see there's a potential, one of the hazards of the job here on Sarah's arm. And as I mentioned, we would band them and report these bands to the bird banding lab of the U.S. Geological Survey. They keep track of all these things. Okay, so here's some data that I just want to illustrate what happened in blueberry land. So we started putting up boxes in 2016. In 2015, there were no boxes. And so in that first year, I set up all these routes where we looked for kestrels. And these were like 8-mile transects that we walked. And what we did was just keep our eye out for kestrels. And we wanted to see if we put more boxes onto the landscape. And there were essentially none when we started. Did the number of kestrels in the landscape increase? So from 2015, when there were no boxes, to 2018, this is what these data represent. So if you go over to the far right where it says all sites, what you can see is that we did have an increase in the landscape as to the number of 1-mile segments that we walked where we spotted kestrels. So whereas it was only 2 kestrels that were spotted in 2015, and that's when I walked 160 miles doing these transects because I didn't have any helpers yet. Then we got the funding so I could bring on some assistance. So by 2018, we had 11 sightings. And so, you know, the proportion of these transects that we walked, it seemed to increase the number of kestrels in the landscape when we put more of these boxes up. Okay, now I want to do a comparison here. You can see in the first line of this table, it says sweet cherries. And then there's the year 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the second line has blueberries. And what this is showing is the percentage of sites, or these 1-mile segments, that had kestrels in them in these different years. And the main thing you can see here is that for the most part in the sweet cherries, we get more kestrel sightings. There seem to be more kestrels in the landscape than we have in the blueberries. So even by year 4, when we'd had boxes up for several years in the blueberries, and these are wide estimates because we have confidence intervals on things, but what you can see is that the sweet cherry occupancy of these sites is pretty high, 75 to 79%. And in blueberries, it's lower. It's probably quite a bit lower than the 72. That's the outside range. But generally, we get less occupancy of boxes in blueberry land compared to cherry land. Now, interestingly, you know, this translates into the number of boxes that are occupied. So you can see on the left-hand side, we have the blueberry study region. Then in the middle of the table is our sweet cherry region. If you just look at the number and percent of boxes occupied in the blueberry study region, you can see from 2016, it's 30%, 35% in 2017, 29% in 2018. So it stays at about 1/3 of the boxes. Whereas if you go over to sweet cherries, you can see that we're typically getting between 88 and 100% occupancy in these boxes. So for some reason, there's a pretty big difference in these two regions as to how many kestrels we're going to get in boxes. And then I think this is my last table slide. Even though we get fewer boxes occupied in the blueberries, which are again on the left side of the table, we do get pretty successful nesting attempts. So for example, of the boxes that were occupied in 2016, about 75% of them produced young, and it was 100% of 8 boxes that were occupied in 2018. So this is pretty comparable to what we see in the cherries, sweet cherries. So even though fewer boxes are occupied in blueberry land, they're as successful in producing young kestrels as those that are occupied in sweet cherry land. So we don't really know why we see these differences between blueberry land and cherry land. This is a site in Leelanau County up in northern Michigan near one of our cherry orchards. You can see the box up. So one thing is that there's a lot of really nice habitat. This is potentially an explanation for why we get such good occupancy up in sweet cherry land. You know, that field to the left is really nice kestrel habitat. They like to hunt where there's short grass. The cherries provide some perches for them. So this is really nice kestrel habitat. It could be that there's less of these open fields in blueberry land, so the kestrel hunting habitat is not as good. That's one potential explanation. Another thing we found in blueberry land was that we got many more starlings in our boxes. So it was pretty rare to find a starling in a kestrel box up in northern Michigan. But down in blueberry land, these were a constant problem. And it could be, you know, one idea I have is that the starlings can start nesting very early in southwestern Michigan because it tends to be warmer down there. And so maybe, you know, that's a deterrent to the kestrels using the boxes. Whereas up north, the starlings can't get started as early, and the kestrels also get started pretty early. So maybe there's something about this interaction that is influencing the degree to which kestrels use the boxes. One thing we also mention to our farmers when we tell them about this work is that kestrels and rodenticides definitely do not mix. So some farmers do use rodenticides. Typically they use them in the fall and winter, which is particularly good when we have kestrels migrating out of the area, because then that's kind of a secure thing that makes sure that the kestrels are not in the area when the rodenticides are being used. And I wanted to talk about a last part of this work that had to do with the social science component. And that is that one of my colleagues at Michigan State, and that's Phil Howard, he was really interested in what fruit consumers' responses would be to different fruit management techniques to keep birds out. And so he had these focus groups with consumers, and he used the questions, he asked these people in the focus groups to develop a national survey that he sent out to fruit consumers, about 1,000 of them. And he looked at their answers to questions about what type of pest bird management procedures they liked or didn't like. And so these are some data he got. And the main thing I'll tell you here is that if you look at where it says nest boxes, you can see there's 2 bars. The dark bar is for apples and the gray bar is for grapes. And this essentially represents how much more per pound people said they would be willing to pay for apples or grapes produced using kestrels as a form of management for pest birds. And that's compared to the vertical line that those bars stem from, which is essentially a pest management technique where a farmer shoots a few birds to scare the rest away. And so I'll point out 2 other things on this graph. One is that you can see down at the bottom, it says local origin. So my colleague Phil also asked people about their preferences for fruit of local origin. And you can see that they were willing to pay as much for fruit produced with kestrel nest boxes as they were for fruit that was of local origin compared to coming from anywhere in the country. So that's a really nice indication that people prefer fruit that's managed with particular types of techniques. And then you'll also see there's an artificial grape flavoring term there. And what that means is that there is a deterrent spray that some farmers use, and it has a chemical in it that irritates birds' membranes. And so it's safe for humans, but what you can see is that people are just not as enthusiastic and are not willing to pay as much for fruit produced with this type of management strategy to deter pest birds compared to a strategy where farmers would shoot a few birds in hopes of scaring the rest away. So growers are starting to use this interest that consumers have in using natural predators in their advertising. So this is a vineyard website where they put up boxes for barn owls. This is in the Western United States. And so we tell farmers that if they let consumers know about these management practices that they use, consumers might be more likely to pay more for their products. You know, to enhance marketing using these types of techniques, consumer awareness has to be high, and often it helps to have a succinct phrase. You know, so something we all know about cage-free, organic production, pasture raised, that kind of thing. So we have thought about terms we could use in this falcon context, maybe falcon friendly or American kestrel habitat. Farmers could use to help advertise their efforts in this way. So special thanks to all of our funders here. And I'll just also mention that these techniques can be used with other birds. So for example, a lot of people put up bluebird boxes, and they can be useful in taking out insects from fruit production systems as well. So in addition to our funders, I also want to thank all the fruit growers who let us work on their property, and also the staff at the MSU field stations in Northern Michigan and Southwestern Michigan. And so I can take questions now if there's any.
Okay, I have some questions that were sent to me. When you were discussing the propane cannons or the inflatable tube people, which species of birds are those trying to keep away? Is there like a specific group?
So the fruit-eating birds, as many of you could probably guess, that are particularly damaging to fruit crops in Michigan are things like American robins, cedar waxwings, grackles, blue jays. So those aren't supposed to work against any one species, but they're hoped to work against this suite of fruit-eating species.
Okay. What design did you use for the kestrel boxes?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So there is a man in Northern Michigan. His name is Tom Comfort, C-O-M-F-O-R-T. And he has the nest box design, and it's actually on the internet. And it's a pretty, I would say it's a pretty nice design. The kestrels like these boxes. There's a lot of features to them. They're quite big. And I'm not sure if Tom is still selling them, but you can also get them online pretty easily from a number of companies that sell kestrel boxes.
Great. Are the starlings problematic or helpful for the fruit? Do they eat the fruit or eat the pests that eat the fruit?
Okay, that's a great question because I should have made that clear. Yes, no, the starlings are not something we want to provide nesting sites for. So they do eat fruit. They can be a fruit consuming bird. And, you know, they're an invasive species as well. They're not native to the United States. And so, and they've also been implicated in spreading, I can't remember if it's, I think it's E. coli or is it salmonella, from dairy operations to fruit growing operations, because sometimes dairies and fruit growing operations are in the same locale, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. So starlings are definitely not a species that we'd want to encourage.
Okay. How do you know that kestrels will like the boxes?
We don't know that they'll like the boxes, but as I mentioned, we've had very good uptake in Northern Michigan, and about a third of them are occupied in Southwestern Michigan. So they seem to be, you know, acceptable to the kestrels. You know, kestrels will also use natural cavities, but there's a number of nest box programs across the country. And so kestrels seem to take quite well to nest boxes. And I should also mention too, there's an organization that is an arm of the Peregrine Fund, and it's called the American Kestrel Partnership. And if anyone was interested, you can put kestrels up on your property if you have appropriate property. You can keep track of what goes on, and you can submit your data to the American Kestrel Partnership. So it's another kind of citizen science program along the lines of some of the things that Cornell University sponsors.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Let's see. Next question. Do you know, are growers employing bat houses to deter insects from their crops?
You know, I haven't heard about a lot of that. I know once in a while we'll come across someone who's using a bat roost, but I haven't seen that to quite the degree that we see people using the kestrel boxes.
Okay, and then I think our last question is, so this shows that if kestrels are present, then the total birds present goes down 2/3. But do not other birds not benefit cherry production by eating a lot of insects that harm cherry trees?
Well, that's a good point.
Complex.
Yeah, that's a good point. And so we're doing some more, I would say, detailed work now to try and look at, right, if your kestrel is deterring fruit-eating birds, it may also be deterring insect-eating birds, which can benefit the farmers. So we're looking at that now. One of my students is trying to figure out how many insect-eating birds are deterred versus fruit-eating birds, so we can get a better handle on that kind of thing. Now, it may not be as much of a benefit to the farmer deterring the fruit-eating birds as it is the number of voles they're consuming. You know, it's going to depend on the actual numbers of fruit-eating birds that are deterred, of insect-eating birds that are deterred, of voles that are taken out of the system. So you're right, that's a good question, and it's complicated, and it awaits answers. I will say one thing, you should not put a kestrel box and a bluebird box up in the same area, because the kestrels sometimes take advantage, and they'll go take out bluebird nestlings if they get the chance. So you want to be careful about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I had a question. How do the voles eat the fruit?
No, what the voles mainly do is that they will, and they're particularly damaging to young trees, because they'll often in the winter, they'll eat the bark around the young tree. You know, they're often under the snow in these tunnel systems. And so they can girdle young trees pretty easily. So that's one of the main problems that fruit growers have with voles.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Okay. I think that is everything. Thank you everybody for joining us. I really love the presentation. I think it's really fascinating work. Thank you so much for presenting for us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yes, thank you. And I think that is all. So we will see everybody for our next presentation. So everything will be advertised in our Flyway Express emails. And if you are not getting those, just send us an email at staff@detroitaudubon.org, and we can put you on that email list. Okay.
Ava?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, will there be a transcript or a copy of this presentation available if we want to share it with, I belong to a group of orchid growers, not that orchid growers have problems like this, that kestrels, but they're flower and animal lovers, and I'd love for a lot of them to be able to see this whole presentation as well.
Yeah, we're going to work on sending something out. We might not be able to include all of the information because I think some of it has not been published yet, but we'll develop something that can be shared, and we'll make sure that gets to you.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. If you want to email me or email the staff email separately too, just to make sure, yeah, we would be happy and possibly put you in touch with Dr. Lindell as well.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.